challenging evolution. So far, we have talked quite a bit about Baudrillard's ideas. We've said that values today are collapsing or have already collapsed, and that, however, the movement of progress can remain intact. It might seem strange, but it makes sense, as the interior movement of society is continuing due to inertia because it remains as its self-evident and autonomous function. But such a functionality no longer has a boundary because it does not derive from some idea, leading all its subsystems, ecological, biological, to an impasse, exactly because it has lost its meaning, its limits. But if the concept of progress has internally collapsed, as the concept of evolution that used to incorporate it itself has epistemologically collapsed, this happened not because the shift towards a certain direction stopped, but because people stopped hoping for something. They stopped dreaming another social utopia. But since this collapse is taking place, modern society, succumbed to consumption, seems to not need it. The concept itself, however, itself a product of the Enlightenment that questioned God's authority, disintegrating inside radical epistemological criticism, sour that it itself was feeding, maybe to a greater extent, all that violence it claimed to fight. But this violence, as it is actualized in the midst of modern knowledge, science and education, the economy and the state, also looks like it's automatically growing within their own self-evident and limitless function. So let's see how we can compose a new analytical criticism on the concept of evolution through the conclusions certified by the thinking of the 20th century, a criticism which will be briefly analyzed in the following 10 fundamental sentences. Of course, these compositions can also still retain their meaning as denial, to avoid the traps that are everywhere even when progress as a value has collapsed. But first, to avoid any misinterpretation, let's define the two relevant concepts of progress and evolution which we just mentioned. Progress is social well-being in relation to some value. Evolution is the epistemological theory of improvement, of gradation, and of superiority based on some models. Now let's see 10 critical propositions on evolution. The first 5 are more theoretical and regard central conclusions not just on the concept of evolution, but on the foundations of knowledge and action themselves. The second 5 regard the historical results to which such a cognitive regulation has aimed or aims. Propositions. First, we can't think about evolution beyond the subjective cognitive model it denotes, what it means, how it exists, etc. Note that this cognitive model itself, any model, has long ceased to serve some general and indubitable truth. Second, as a result of the first proposition, we can't claim an evolution in any valid way because no claim can support its validity except for within itself, meaning that it has to refer to itself, to its own truth. Our contribution here is our thought that any such model corresponds to a specific ontological dimension. Third, therefore, the composition of values, of indubitable first truths, and of models as metaphysical principles are points of arbitrary choices that pertain to our desires and causes. Fourth, the cause and the desire cannot be justified within any cognitive system, because the cognitive system is what is based on causes and values that are exogenous to it and precede it, even though subsequently every knowledge system, I'm not using the word ideology, will support the causes for which it was created. We call this fact material priority. Fifth, these compositions of value and anterior desire are not internally defined by the individual themselves, but they mainly regard impositions of socio-economic modes and cultural conventions. And this means that any rigid system like ours classifies any other way of life based on the arbitrary criteria it imposes on it. The methods and modalities of this classification takes place based on its target setting on beings and things. Sixth, what we consider to be evolution today is based on socio-political cause and the desires of our historical horizon, which means that it is based on the historical courses of Western humans, those that are composed as organizations of social submission and courses of violence. 7. The existing, though stillborn, theories of evolution, and even more so the self-evident functionality of the system that replaced them itself, closed up within themselves, are basically ignoring the diversity and variations of other ways of life, recognizing only the life inside the industrial capitalistic system, inside a framework that undeniably supports their submission to it. Eighth, the denial of the autonomous value of diversity that evolutionism internally attempts, and even more so the automation of socio-economic functions, leads to homogeneity and totalitarianism, making systems exponentially grow their influence, always leading the world to its extreme ontological limits. Ninth, as every knowledge system is produced inside its causes, which mainly regard a social process, the preservation of a substantial critical stance towards evolution would emerge through a different cognitive position. We will see where that would be more analytically later on. Able to define the anterior knowledge and the system it supports as a deviation, a variation, a mutation, an alternation, or degeneration. This webinar cycle will follow the path of a different perspective, clearing the paths of other ontological roads. 10th, such a tendency of evolution by principle means nothing but the revelation of an ontological dimension that transcends it, a dimension that showcases the desire for violence as its dominant element. In our opinion, this ferocious atrocity that overcomes us as a human genus, with the great wars we have experienced and through the gigantic destructive mechanisms we set in motion at every level, formations that are not on the margins, but in the center of our system, in the centers of our knowledge and practice, cannot be explained in another way. When forming the above-mentioned suggestions, however, we will be tempted to take it one step further, as we realize that these are what inevitably lead us to some further self-evident questioning. Points of the challenge. First, why are we more evolved socially, for instance, than those we consider savage people, which of course we have long subjugated? Which assessment system claims our superiority if not the one we have constructed ourselves? Or is any affirmation here not undermining the validity of our argument? It's like a murderer going to court and proposing some legal arguments based on the system he has created himself and he himself preside over, isn't it? Second, the inability to consider as valid some system of absolute assessment of our own loses the possibility of proof in association to anything. For instance, the possibility to convince someone that we are more evolved than an ant or a cockroach. This happens because in terms of the modality of these beings, in terms of the dimensions of their lives, there is a gap and incompatibility, and we can therefore not set criteria that concern them based on our way of life, as this gap will always be between us. Consequently, an anthropocentrism by principle probably corresponds to some disguised conceit and arrogance, even hybris. And hybris, as we know, always took the form of violence. We should point out that hybris is the worldview of ancient Greeks, meant that arrogant overestimation of the capacities and the loss of natural boundaries, or unwritten divine laws of some subject as a loss of their balance that led to violence, physical, socio-political, and economic. This extreme continuation of violating the moral and natural order of the world finally ended with the destruction of the subject, as that is where the consequences of his actions themselves led it, by making divine justice intervene and restore the balance. Third, after all, on this kind of worldviews that of course always include disguised hierarchies of beings and exclusions of other forms of life, is where those bloody exclusions based on human criteria, the exclusion of the barbarians, of black people, of women, of other beings, because of the imperialism and violence on people and the planet took place. What else could it eventually meant to actualize a knowledge system and an assessment between men and women, children and adults, savages and civilized people, as each of these dimensions corresponds to a different state of life? Maybe what is being justified is nothing but this conscious or unconscious desire for violence that rises to a cognitive cause and that claims it consciously or unconsciously within its truth. Fourth, finally, let's ask ourselves what, and mainly in which ways, can we know? This is what we will extensively delve into after all. We will now just briefly mention that we can only assess something within certain cognitive codes that pertain to certain concepts and properties and therefore relevant functions that have to do with goals and therefore orientations in life and the world, dimensions which in turn refer to ways of life, to ontological states. We can thus use such codes as long as we don't really take them seriously, and mainly as long as we do not generalize a process that composes their totalitarian tendency. In conclusion, based on all the above, we could consider the idea of evolution in our society as an arbitrary concept, an abstract and made-up concept. In general, what it justifies as self-value is the total growth of technology, of the capital, of economic expansion, a tendency that is integrated in the ontological pattern it serves. Under the prism of this growth, other non-mechanical processes become invisible, while the modalities of the existence of those other internal qualities that are presented as closeness to nature, and even the fields of those knowledges that open up through the synergy and recognition of sensory forms and qualities that exist not as abstracts and commercialized aesthetics, not as external data of interaction, but as internal insights to existential levels that are spreading beyond the relations of empathy of natural beings as composition of the world are completely ignored. Therefore, our era fails to understand the utmost philosophical lesson, the lack of causes in nature, and that what the game of life itself consists of our physical and mental health, emerge through strong emotions and our spontaneous interpretations of various natural fields, phenomena that are simply created by broadening our expressive abilities towards the world, thus reinventing life every day as a new process that is raised as intercommunication of beings, a dimension that can be examined in a completely different way beyond the narrow exploitative, cognitive, and emotional model produced by the modern world. But if today we find ourselves in this negative state which I described, this means that all this happened due to evolution. In other words, due to the progress of some processes that are principally organized on our cognitive patterns. But we will elaborate on that in other videos. I'm Konstantinos Angelou, and this is a channel for radical philosophy. If you found what we talk about interesting, you can subscribe and like the video. You can also share it with anyone who would also be interested in these ideas.